could you say something? Can you explain that? Help us understand what happened.
Well, what happened was that the reporters went there. The National Assembly was having sessions. It was the State of the Nation address, and they went there for coverage. And they found some NI officers at the gates of the National Assembly. When they identified themselves that they were from Independent, they were told that they wouldn't be allowed to enter.
Interesting. 2nd July 2004, Abdoulaye Sy, again Alaji Yoro Jallow and Deida Haidara, they were taken to the Serious Crimes Unit and questioned in connection with the oil scandal involving the Gambian and Nigerian governments. Was that the Nigerian aid to Gambia, the lifting of crude oil?
Yes, that's exactly.
They were arrested for that?
Yes.
And then in April 2004, the Independent was attacked.
Yes.
And the premises burnt, and the Independent staff were forced and locked inside, but they escaped without any fatalities. Correct?
That's right.
Now let's talk about Sam Obi, a Nigerian reporter for Radio France International.
Yes. Sam Obi is a Nigerian, and he used to be the Banjul-based correspondent for RFI. So when the GPU organized the protest march in 2004, then he gave that story to Radio France. It was a phone-in interview which he gave, and then he was subsequently arrested and detained as a result of that.
And this was in connection with a protest march over the death?
The death of Deida.
Of Deida Haidara.
Yes.
And Musa Gassama of the Independent? Mamadou Gassama, excuse me, of the Independent?
Yes.
Tell us about it.
He was arrested and then also assaulted by police at Kanifing Estate. And then he was also allegedly subjected to torture. And he, according to what we've gathered, he was investigating for possible publication a story about the closure of MJK Plus Computer Center.
And on October 2005, Pa Modu Seka?
Yeah, so Pa Modu was also arrested in Soma. We don't know exactly for what reason, but then what we do know was that when he was arrested, those that arrested him were accusing him of destroying the good image of the country through this story, by way of writing the kind of stories that he was writing.
On 13 October 2005, the Point newspaper, and there was forceful discontinuation of the newspaper column.
Yes, this was
Good morning, Mr. President.
Yes, this was when the National Intelligence Agency invited Uncle Pap Sen to go there, and when he went there, they told him clearly that they were not going to tolerate any continuation of that particular column that was being run by Deida. So they told him to stop that column, and then he complied.
From what you know, what was this column about? Good morning, Mr. President.
The Good Morning, Mr. President column was created by Uncle Deida, from what we learned. And this is where he almost on a daily basis will criticize or will essentially critique the policies and programs of the government. And of course, he was particularly targeting the presidency about what the presidency does or doesn't do. But then when you look at the column also, you realize that it's also quite diverse, because he was also talking about the situation of farmers, the health situation in the country, and a lot of other social issues.
Musa Sedikan? The Independent?
Okay. So Musa actually had traveled to, I think, South Africa, and then where he chanced upon the South African president, Thabo Mbeki at the time, and then he talked to him about the issue of the murder of Data, and then from what we learned, Thabo Mbeki did promise him that at that level, at the level of the African Union, they were going to see what they could do about the murder of Data. So when he came, he granted an interview to the point where he spoke about his meeting with Thabo Mbeki, as a result of which he was arrested and detained.
And also, it wasn't limited to that. It also extended to the investigation or possible investigation of the killing of the Ghanaians.
Yes, yes. The Ghanaians and, well, let's say the 54 or 44, I'm not sure, West Africans, including some Ghanaians here.
And because he talked to Thabo Mbeki about that,
yes, also about that.
He was arrested and interviewed.
Yes.
And tell us about Trrc on 16 December 2005.
Well, this was the first anniversary of the killing of Data, and the GPU had planned on a protest march to visit the site where Data was shot and killed, and they were prevented by the personnel from the police intervention unit. And so in that process, Ramatoulaye was taking some pictures of the incident, and then he was eventually, assaulted, and they seized his gadgets.
28 March 2006, Madi Cisse of the Independent. This was a closure of the Independent.
Yes.
And it was carried out by the PIU, isn't it?
Yes, very well.
And can you tell us what happened in that particular occasion? I think we went through this before.
We went through this before.
Madi Cisse and Musa
yes.
were
yes.
arrested and detained for 3 weeks.
Yes.
Okay. Ibu Wage?
Ibu Wage, this was in March 2006, 29th March to be specific. He was arrested and detained for about a week before he was released. He was also not charged, and then, it also pleases me to announce that Ibu is also in the hall.
And Malik Mboop, communication officer for RVTH and former reporter of the Daily Observer.
Yeah, so Malik was among the 4 journalists that were rounded up, including Lamin Cham and Pamodu Fall, and also Musa Sharif. And they were taken to the NIA where they were tortured, to which Lamin Cham was giving testimony yesterday.
And this was in connection
with the Freedom newspaper.
With the Freedom newspaper.
Yes.
So it appears Freedom newspaper was also a thorn in the face of Jammeh. Anybody associated with Freedom newspaper would be arrested and detained or tortured.
Very well.
Then 24 July 2006, Sam Obi, Abdul Ghaffari, and Oladimeji, Abdul Ghaffari Oladimeji, sports editor for the Daily Express. And your dispatch suggests that NIA arrested and detained Sam Obi and Abdul Ghaffari, while Suleiman Makalo fled into exile. The journalists were being prosecuted following publication of a press release by civil society organizations condemning the government's blocking of a freedom of expression forum to be held in the Gambia on the sidelines of the African Union Summit.
Yes, it was in 2006. The Gambia was hosting the AU Summit here in Banjul, and on the sidelines of it, there was a planned meeting which was going to focus on freedom of expression, which the government didn't like. I think this particular event was scheduled to be held at Combo Beach Hotel, but the government actually didn't allow the event to hold. So the CSOs released a press release condemning the government for its actions, and the journalist published it, and as a result, they were arrested.
7 September 2006, Dudu Sane, arrested, detained, and tortured.
Yes, we spoke about his case quite at length yesterday.
He is the person who became paralyzed.
Yes.
His first wife abandoned him.
Yes.
And then he later died.
This first wife died, and then.
And the second wife abandoned him.
Yeah.
And then he later died.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about another arrest on 15 June 2009 of Emile Touré, Pamoudou Fall, Sarata Jabi, Pap Sen, Ibrahima Sawane, Sam Sar, Abubakar Sedikan. And this was June 2009. This was the GPU's press release in reaction to Jammeh's derogatory comments about Data Haidara, who was murdered 5 years earlier. They were charged with sedition and criminal defamation.
Yes. Like Pamoudou says, this is a turning point. But then what eventually happened was that Jammeh granted an interview to the GRTS. He was being interviewed by Mr. Keba Diba, who is now late. And during the interview, the question of data, of course, was asked. And the way he responded to it wasn't, well, for the lack of better word, I would say wasn't nice. And I mean, out of my respect for Data, knowing the kind of person he is, I mean, if the commission permits, I wouldn't want to repeat those words. But, I mean, they were not nice. And the GPU at the time, under the leadership of Datafa, who, if I may announce, is also in the hall.
Datafa what?
Datafa Sose, wrote a press release in response to Jammeh's remarks. And as a result of that, the GPU leadership and the two newspapers that published that press release, that is The Point and Foreign newspaper, a total of about 7 people were arrested and detained, and they include Emile Touré, who was the Secretary General at the time, and Sarata Jabi. Sarata was the Vice President, and then Pamoudou Fall. Pamoudou was the Treasurer of the GPU at the time. At the point, they arrested Uncle Pap Sen, who was the proprietor, and they also arrested Ibrahima Sawane. Ibrahima was the news editor at the time. And when they went to Foria, they arrested Uncle Sam Sar. Sam Sar is the managing editor of Foria newspaper. But of course, they found Abubakar Sedikan there when they were effecting the arrest of Uncle Sam. And Abubakar Sedikan was trying to take pictures of, these people arresting Sam, and they also took him along, and so that's what happened. And this saving journalists, it became later known as the case of the 6 journalists. They were taken to the NIA, where they were detained, and then later they were charged and then prosecuted and convicted on charges of sedition and defamation.
And they were sentenced to 2-year jail terms.
Yes, they were sentenced to 2-year jail term.
But were subsequently pardoned.
Yes, after spending 20-something days in prison, they were given presidential pardon. Of course, the GRTS came and they brought GRTS, I will put it that way, for them to apologize to the president. Which all of them, I think, were very careful not to do. Of course, they wouldn't say anything that was critical, but then they wouldn't also apologize in the way the government or the security people wanted them to be. But of course, that was what eventually led to the exile of 2 people. Buya Jammeh. Buya was also an executive member, I think a co-opted member of the GPU executive, and then Datafa, because they tried to arrest Buya, said then Buya ran away, and now he's in the US. And then Datafa at the time was in Mali, because they, of course, as the president of GPU, also had a position at the West African Journalists Association, where he was coordinating a sub-regional project. And as a coordinator, his presence was required there. So he spent time in Mali. So whilst he was there, then of course, they, she never came back until now, yeah.
And this system of apologizing to Jammeh in exchange for a pardon was basically a modus operandi of the Jammeh government. As far as you know, is that the case?
Yes, it happened in a number of cases. And then even in our discussions or sometimes in our professional forums, we do discuss this thing, whether it is appropriate for journalists to go to those places and broadcast the testimonies of those people the way they usually do. And then we talk about how ethical or otherwise it is. And as journalists, we know that actually if you can't tell the full story, then perhaps you shouldn't be there. And most times they don't allow you to tell the full story.
Now, 22nd June 2009, Augustine Kanja, or Kanjia, from The Point, he too was arrested for taking pictures of riot police trying to control a large crowd outside the magistrate's court during the hearing of the case of the 6 journalists or 7 journalists. What do you say about that?
As you can see, the regime is constantly nervous when it comes to the question of who killed Data. And as a result, a lot of people were victimized merely for that. So these 6 journalists, their case was first being heard at the magistrate's court in Kanifing. So Augustine was a reporter for The Point, and he was merely at the outskirts of the court and taking pictures, actually in the street, literally. Then some PIU officers saw him taking pictures of the crowd, and they came and arrested him, and they took him away.
Cameras were dangerous equipments during that time for journalists. You take pictures, you get arrested. We've seen quite a few of that happening. 7 January 2013, Abdoulaye John.
Well, this particular incident, I was there with John. This was when you go up to Sibanor, there's a road that branches off, it goes towards the Dasilame end. So that's where you have the borders between Gambia and Senegal. So there were some Senegalese soldiers who were arrested by the rebels in Casamance, the rebels under the command of Salif Sadio. And Salif wanted to release these rebels. And the negotiation actually happened between Sadio and an organization in Italy called Sant'Isidio. It is formed by the former foreign minister of Italy. So they did this negotiation, and they wanted to release these soldiers, of course for political reasons, but they don't want to give it to Senegal, so they wanted an intermediary. So that is how Gambia was invited to come in to receive these soldiers. And of course, I was at the time writing for AFP, and Ablai was writing for AP. So only the 2 of us were invited as, non-government journalists to be there. But the government, they were not actually aware of our presence there. So when we reached there, then they saw us and they started asking questions. And there was this State House photographer, Gassama, I forgot the first name, who started, like taunting us, telling us, why are you guys here? Why are you guys here? And then Ablai responded to him. Then Numo Kujabi was the NIA chief at the time. He was there, and that was how they bundled Ablai, and then they whisked him away from that scene. Of course, myself, I was invited by the then Interior Minister Osman Sonko and the Secretary General Njoguba, and was told that I would be allowed to go into Casamance, with the rebels, but then I shouldn't share my story with anyone. But when Ablai came, then Ablai was detained at the NIA, and Ablai's case is sad.
Ablai Kujabi was the then Director General of NIA.
Yes.
And from that operation, he was detained,
yes,
arrested and detained.
Yes.
And you, as journalists, you were invited to attend and witness, but you cannot share the story or the information with anyone.
Well, yeah. They told me specifically, in fact, the interior minister told me, if you share this story with anyone, I mean, you will have problems, you know.
Didn't you remind them that you were a journalist?
Well, at that instant, it was a bit tough. So what I did was I complied with them. I wanted my story. I went with them into the bush and then met the rebels, saw the soldiers, and then did whatever we wanted to do. But when we came out eventually, I not only shared my story. In fact, when they wanted to write the story in a manner that was not truly representative of what happened, I wrote a commentary to debunk that.
What did they say?
Well, they said that actually Jammeh was the one who negotiated that, which was quite not true. It wasn't accurate.
So they wanted to hijack the glory?
Well, yeah.
And give it to Jammeh?
And give it to Jammeh, yeah.
When he played a minor role in this whole thing?
Definitely, yeah.
After there was breakthrough?
Yes.
He was just there as a recipient?
Yeah. In fact, the Santi Isidio official, I was just having lunch with him and I told him, because we had some delay and I told him that, but why is this happening? And he told me, well, in a very enigmatic way, we don't necessarily need to have credit for this. And then he stopped there. So it was later that I started interpreting what he meant by that. Maybe the government of the Gambia wanted to take full credit for what happened. So in the end, they had to give in because they were just there as negotiators, and what they were most concerned about was the freedom of the Senegalese soldiers.
But regardless, you wrote an article debunking the claims by the government.
Yeah, the GRTS published it, broadcast it, but it was also it was the same reporter who shared the story with Observer and The Point, the same story, so I had to write a commentary to debunk it.
And did they come after you?
No.
Lucky you. Maybe this time around, your commentary was written, right?
Yeah, it was written and published.
Would the situation have been different if that was mentioned in the radio? That, oh, President Jammeh's claim that he negotiated the deal to release rebels from Casamas was in fact not true. He merely received them. How do you think that would have been received if this statement was made over radio?
It wasn't going to be. I mean, I never believed in luck until I became a journalist. I mean, I was just some lucky guy, but it was going to be terrible, very likely.
And Mr. Job, is it the same person?
The same person we spoke about yesterday.
Yes. Alaji Job of the Daily Observer. He too was arrested on 7 February 2013, wasn't he?
Yes.
And he too was tortured.
Yes.
And he was kept in custody and tried for 1 year, 6 months.
Yes.
And he was acquitted on the 3rd of September.
Yes.
And Pasulei Jadama, a freelance photographer?
Well, this was at the Banjul Magistrates Court, and Lamin Babanding Jabate and Pahari Jammeh, who were Attorney General and Solicitor General respectively, were being tried on allegations of fraud, I think, if I remember quite well. And then, so this guy was there, a photographer, and he was taking pictures, and then eventually he got arrested.
And 1 January 2015, Teranga FM was ordered to stop broadcasting.
Yes.
And this was the failed coup of 30 December 2014. Correct?
Yes.
And what happened to them? They were banned, weren't they?
Well, they were told not to be reviewing the newspapers in local languages, also in this instance.
And on that same day, police arrested Alaji Abdoulaye Cisse and detained him in Yundum.
Yes. it's happened.
And Alhaji Abdullah Sise was the son of the proprietor or the...
The son of the proprietor,
yes, okay,
yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, fast forward to 17 July 2008, Abdul Hamid Adiamo, a Nigerian publisher.
Yeah, Adiamo was the proprietor of and the editor of Today newspaper. And I must say, Today also contributed a lot to, because Today actually was the first newspaper in the Gambia to print colored newspaper. So he also is a very brilliant guy. So on this instance, he published an article about children not going to school, but going to some dump sites where they will pick some scrap metals, and then they will go and sell those scrap metals for some food. So that's the story that he wrote. And then the problem the authorities had with the story in particular, they said, was the fact that he used the picture of a child. Of course, the child wasn't quite identifiable, but then they said, why would he do that? But we do know that the true motive was that the story kind of, well, what you can interpret it to mean that the government is not taking, enough steps to take care of children.
At the end of the day, he had to pay a fine of $100,000.
Yes, yes.
Just for publishing the image of an unidentifiable child.
Yes.
He has to pay $100,000 a fine. Interesting. Let's move on to...
So if I may correct, actually, on this instance, I think the case was eventually withdrawn. The $100,000, I have to correct that, he was fined $100,000 is when Gumbo Toure was facing trial at the magistrate's court in Banjul. Of course, Gumbo made some allegations against Professor Carr, and Adiamo wrote a commentary or a news analysis of the testimony at the courts, and then for which he, was believed to have, done some contempt of court, and he was fined to pay $100,000.
Or he made a commentary of a matter that was sub judice.
Yes.
And on the basis of that, he was charged with contempt and fined $100,000.
Yeah.
All right. Contempt can be a serious offense sometimes.
Sure.
28 March 2007, Fatou Jaumane, US-based contributor to allgambian.net. And what happened to her?
Well, Fatou was a reporter at the Daily Observer before she left for the US. And then in 2007, she was coming back because her father, I think, if I remember quite well, passed away. And he was coming to attend, those rituals. And upon arrival at the airport, so she was arrested and she was taken away and detained and prosecuted. She was charged with false news because they claim that she wrote an article on allgambia.net. In this article, she essentially was saying that, of course, Jammeh, had failed the Gambians on the many promises that he gave them, and as a result, Gambians are living in poverty, and Jammeh was a bundle of terror. So because of those comments, then she was charged with false news. And this particular case is quite significant because, it was also presided over by the same magistrate who presided over the case of Lamin Fati. That was Magistrate Bouba. In fact, when Fatou was first charged, the case was given to Pahari, but Pahari declined. And of course, at the time, we know when a magistrate declines a case, I mean, it's perhaps because of something. Then the matter was given to Bouba. Bouba had a reputation as the journalist magistrate, because any journalist that appears before him, of course, he was going to convict and sentence you. Even though the lawyer at the time for Fatou Diaw made a case that, Buba's court didn't have any jurisdiction over this case, Buba refused to let the case go. So he presided over it, and then he eventually convicted Fatou. Of course, it was very serious.
And a fine of $250,000 he was imposed.
Yes.
But we would come back to this later, the laws, the repressive laws.
Sure.
It appears that the same set of laws were used to prosecute most journalists.
Yes.
False information, defamation, sedition, and things like that.
Sure.
But we will come back to that later. Now let's move on to Alhaji Abdoulaye Cisse, Managing Director of Teranga FM. He too has suffered quite significantly.
Yes. So
this time abduction, 2nd July 2015. Can you tell us more about that?
So it was in this instance that he was actually taken away and tortured. So we said abduction because even at the time, that's how we put it in our press release, that he was literally abducted. Because Abdoulaye was going with a friend. I mean, when he called someone to meet the person, and all of a sudden, I mean, there was a car that pulled over in front of him, and they just picked him secretly like that, and they denied knowing his whereabouts. And this was the time that he was tortured, and eventually he was prosecuted. And during the trial, he escaped and fled into Senegal, and now, yeah.
This is the person who made that dramatic escape from RVH?
Yes.
Now we go back to our own Baba Gale Jallow again, 27 December 1999.
Yes, and I must say I'm sorry, because what we tried to do was to put this in a
chronological order.
Yeah, but we couldn't. We ended up having some of these things quite late, so we just put it like that. But yeah, so that's what happened with Baba Gale Jallow. There was a report on the Independent that suggesting that Jammeh had a new wife in Sintet, and then for which, yeah.
People have to be careful about alleging new marriages. 9 January 2019, Mamadou Saliou Diallo or Mamadou S. Diallo, Daily News.
Yeah, so he was actually charged with for publishing false news because there was, every year Jammeh used to give a package to people, and there was this particular chief who it was alleged had given this package to a woman who he had been sharing some extramarital issues. So he was indicted. But then the case was later dropped. It never went to court.
Okay. Well, some of these allegations, it's quite interesting. Presidential Hajj package scandal. Chief Balde allegedly bribes lover. Interesting headline. And anyway, so let's move on to the next, 31 March 1995, Pap Sen. I think we had covered this one.
Yeah,
that
because we were talking about...
Yes, Pap Sen, Aliou Badara Sow, and Ibrahim Ernest.
Yes.
This is what led to Mr. Ernest's
deportation. Yes.
To Sierra Leone. Now let's fast forward to April 2006, Lamin Fati.
Yes.
He was arrested and detained in Communicado for 63 days and severely tortured and given electric shocks. And he was sentenced, convicted, and fined $50,000. And this was the fine that was paid by the GPU, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now to Abdul Hamid Adiamo. Did we deal with this one?
No, this is a separate one.
This is 10 June 2009. So this would be his second running in with the law.
Definitely.
With the NIA.
Definitely.
And on this particular occasion, he made a report about the firing of the Minister of Justice, Minister of Lands, and the Speaker.
Yes, I think he made an error, a slight error in the story. But then that's what happened because everyone had the same story that Adiamo had. Jammeh did fire these people, but I think what happened is in the middle of it, so he changed his mind on some of them. So the other papers were able to get the new development, but Adiamo didn't get it, so he published it and he got into trouble.
Sometimes it's like a race between him and the newspapers. If the newspapers beat him to announcing it, he changes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this one, 13 January 2014, Seni Marena, a freelance reporter, and Musa Serif of The Voice.
Yes, Seni was actually working at the Standard. So when Standard was shut down, then he started freelance journalism. And then he was selling some of his stories to The Voice newspaper. So on this particular case, there was a meeting by the UDP it wasn't a rally, it was just a town hall that they had in the village of Tanje. And during that meeting, then they announced that some 19 EPRC young people had actually switched sides, yeah, effectively. They joined the UDP, which Seni reported, and as a result of which he was arrested, detained. Musa Sharif was the editor of The Voice, so they both were arrested, detained, prosecuted. Luckily for them, they were acquitted and discharged. But the magistrate that actually discharged them, shortly afterwards, had to run for her life.
Who was that magistrate?
It was a Hakim. I wouldn't get the first name, but some lady, young woman. She probably was in her mid-20s or so.
This time the case didn't go to the journalist magistrate, correct?
Yes, yes.
Was it Jacqueline?
Jacqueline, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sagar. 27 June 2014, Sana Kamara of the Standard?
Yes, Sana wrote an article about the human trafficking in the Gambia. And this article was actually from the, United States annually publishes reports on the situation of human trafficking in the world. And Sana got this report and he published it. And it didn't paint a good picture of the Gambia, that we are kind of failing in our responsibility in protecting people against being trafficked. So as a result, he was arrested and detained. Sana afterwards had to run.
Exile was the answer for Sana, wasn't it?
Yes.
15 September 2013, Fatou Kamara. That would be the proprietress for the Fatou show, isn't it?
Yes.
And tell us about that one.
Well, in the case of Fatou Kamara, what happened was that she was hosting a show on GRTS called the Fatou Show. And also at the same time, she was the Director of Press and Public Relations at the Office of the President. And she got arrested because it was believed that she shared information with Freedom newspaper. And yeah, she got arrested and she was detained for some time. I think, she was detained for some time. And at the time, what happened was that the GPU actually approached one of the lawyers, Sagar Jate, to invoke the Women's Act for her to be released. And by the time we actually filed that, she was already granted. Well, while we were filing that, then we received a call that she was being taken to the Banjul Magistrates Court. Then we had to rush there,
Ultimately, she too filed the case against the Jammeh government, didn't she?
Well, that was the same case with Lamin Fati and Fatou Jaumane.
And received compensation?
Yeah, received compensation.
Thank you very much. But her supposed crime was sharing information with Freedom newspaper?
Yes.
September 2011, Saikou Cisse arrested by the police?
Yes. This was because of Nanama's case, because Nana Maketa was the sports editor at the Daily Observer, and he was alleged to have shared some information with Freedom newspaper. So he, as a result of that, he lost his job at Observer. But apart from that, he also he wrote a petition to the Office of the President to say that the Daily Observer wrongfully terminated his services, and as a result of that, he was arrested, detained, and prosecuted. So while that trial was ongoing, he applied for bail and was granted bail. So Saikou Ceesay, who was an executive member of the GPU, came to his rescue and provided him with his documents. So Nanama jumped bail. He fled because he couldn't take it, and so Saikou was called, and then so he was asked to pay the fine, the bail bond of $100,000, which the GPU paid.
For some, exile was the answer,
yes.
And Saikou has to now come and pay for guaranteeing the appearance of Namana.
Yes.
It seems like Freedom newspaper was the nemesis of Jammeh outside, as the Independent was the Jammeh's problem in the inside.
That's right.
So Saikou Ceesay again, reporter for the Foroya newspaper, on 15 June 2008, arrested and detained at the Kotu police station.
Yes, then he was a reporter for, it's the same Saikou Ceesay. Then he was a reporter for the Foroya newspaper. On this instance, it was Dida Halaki, who was a dual Ethiopian British citizen, but was working in the Gambia and was quite close to the presidency. I think he was the one who replaced Sayatal as the managing director of Observer. So Dida Halaki was arrested, and then he was detained at Kotu police station. So Saikou went there to find out about that particular case, and then so he took pictures of Dida, and then they,
Again, the camera is a problem.
Yes.
So Mafuji Ceesay in 2015?
Mafuji actually, Jammeh was having a political rally in Sukuta. And then Mafuji at the time was with the Voice newspaper. So he went there, and then he was just in the middle of the crowd. He didn't even go to where near the president was. So he was just taking notes and recording. And some, soldiers or military people saw him, and then they just came and dragged him from the crowd, and they kind of rough-handled him, and they took him behind where the podium was, or where the VIP tent was. And there they threatened him. I mean, some of the threats were quite serious, that they were going to kill him. In fact, some of the questions they were asking him was, where are you working? He told them, I'm working for the Voice. And then they asked, is that an underground newspaper or something like that? But that's what happened to him.
And 2014, Sana Kamara, Daily News.
Yeah, so in this instance, what happened was that at the time, the tourism authorities were complaining that a lot of bombsters, or, well, so to speak, were causing nuisance around the tourism development area. And there were reports that soldiers were going to the beaches and arresting these young people, beating them, torturing them, and there were claims that some of them were, or some of them died as a result of that. So Sana and I actually went there to the beach, and then we had interviews with some of the boys there, and they told us a lot of stuff. So when we were coming, then Sana took a picture of someone who is from one of these Eastern European countries. I don't know the country exactly, but he was believed to be a pilot for the president. So he said, why did we take him a picture? And then, so he started complaining. Then he called the soldiers who came, and then they arrested us, and they took us to the Senegambe station. We were there until around 8, and then released.
Is that the same incident as the 27 June arrest of Sana which had to do with human trafficking.
Oh, it's different.
It's different.
Yes.
And on this second occasion, he was alone and he was arrested and detained at Bundung police station.
Yes.
And he also, as a result of that arrest, crossed the border and went into exile.
Yes.
November 10, 2016, Alaji Manka, photojournalist.
So this was during the presidential nomination, and Jammeh was going to the IEC to get his nomination done. And Alaji Manka is a photojournalist, and while Jammeh wasn't even there yet, but while he was taking pictures of the APRC crowd that gathered there, he was arrested and taken to the NIA, where he was detained.
And Dida Halake again, the managing director for the Daily Observer?
Yes, Dida. So he was arrested because they said he gave false information to a public officer. I am not sure we know exactly what this false information was about. But I must say, Dida Halake was quite an interesting character, because when he came during the 2008 Congress of the GPU, where Ndeta Fasose was elected as president, Dida was the one who led the campaign against the GPU at the time. Matter of fact, he wrote an article to say that GPU was not Gambia Press Union, it was Gambia Political Union. And then immediately after Ndeta was elected, he also published something on the Observer to say that those that were interested in setting up an alternative body were invited to go there. Eventually, this didn't happen, but what we know was that shortly after all those things, he himself got arrested. And when he got arrested, the first people that he called was the GPU executive and Saikou to go to his rescue. And of course, Saikou also didn't respond, because in fact, when he wrote that, then Saikou also wrote back on the news and report to say that if you say that the GPU means Gambia Political Union, your name also Halaki in Mandinka means someone who is cursed. So they had that kind of argument, but then so he's in the UK now.
Indeed. And on 10th November 2016, Yunus Saliu.
So it was on the same day that Alaji Manka was also arrested when this nomination process was ongoing. Yunus was reporting for the Daily Observer, and he also was taking pictures of the APRC crowd that gathered there. I think what they had problems with more was that Yunus was taking a photo of the presidency and the crowd using his mobile phone.
So taking pictures was a problem with the mobile phone. Bakari Fati, 9 November 2016.
Bakari and Mahmoud Sabali were arrested together. Bakari Fati was he still is the uncle at GRTS on agriculture programs. So on this particular instance, what happened was that he went to Kanilai, I understand, to record an activity by the former First Lady, an agricultural activity, and then he brought this particular material to GRTS, but it was not played. At the time, Maud Sabali was the managing director. What was eventually played was the nomination of the opposition leader, Mama Kande, because it was the same day that Mama Kande also had his nomination, and by law, GRTS was required to broadcast that. So they broadcast that instead of the agricultural activity by the former First Lady, and as a result, they were both arrested and detained. And particularly for Bakari, I think he was released only after Jammeh had left.
These people were arrested for doing what the law required them to do.
Yeah.
Interesting. And there is one we skipped, this should have come earlier. That was the June 2001 arrest of Mamadou Thomas.
Yes, it was in Basse where Modu Thomas was covering the National Youth Conference and Festival called the NACONF, and then in his report he reported that the organizers of the NACONF didn't provide enough food and sleeping facilities for people there, and as a result he was arrested.
For saying there was not enough food and enough accommodation?
Yes.
And for that reason he was arrested and detained?
Yes.
April 16, 2009, Moses Nden, Keba Yoromane of City Limits Radio.
Moses and Keba used to host a radio program on City Limits Radio, a sports program. So on this instance, they had an argument with the permanent secretary of Ministry of Youth and Sport at the time, Mr. Mamanyik Njai, and as a result, they were arrested and detained briefly.
You disagree with the permanent secretary, you are arrested.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 27 June 2011, Alao Ahmad Alota.
Yeah, Alota is also a Nigerian. In fact, he worked with Deda, and he was the one who co-authored alongside Demba Jao the autobiography or the biography of Deda called A Living Mirror. He was the one who wrote it, and he later became the executive director of the Gambia Press Union. On this instance, Native Asose was in exile, also contesting for GPU presidency. And they had to talk to those that were on the ground. And as a president, he was required to give a statement during the Congress. And Alota facilitated that by allowing him to come on Skype and talk to people. And as a result of that, he was detained, arrested, yeah.
You talk to Panderimba, you detained. You talk to Ndei Tafaso, you're also detained. Right? That's what it seemed like at the time, correct?
Yes.
And July 2001, Madi Njai was also arrested, a journalist?
Yes.
Could you tell us about that too?
So Madi was so Media Foundation for West Africa is based in Ghana, and the GPU is an institutional member of the Media Foundation for West Africa. So what they also do is that they monitor press freedom violations, and Madi was regularly sending reports to them on what was happening on the ground. And as a result, he was arrested and forced to open his email, which he did.
And Fabakary Cissé of the Foroya in 2007?
Yeah, so Fabakary was also arrested when he was covering a protest by students in 2007.
And he too was beaten? He
was beaten, and they also destroyed his press gadgets and took away his notebook.
Uncle Pap Sen again in February 2009. Could you tell us about that one?
Yes, Uncle Pap, 2009 was quite a tough year for Uncle Pap, definitely, because in this particular case, what happened was that the Point reported that Mr. Lamin Sanyang, that was, he's the son of the former Director General of GRS, Modu Sanyang, and then he was a diplomat. He was working in the Foreign Service. So the Point reported that Lamin Sanyang was being detained at Mile 2, a Gambian diplomat. And they arrested him and charged him with false publication, because the police said that Lamin Sanyang was not being detained at Mile 2, he was being detained at NIA. So that was false. And not
the fact of the detention was false, but the place of detention.
Yes, that's what they said. So the other time, this one was because they said he wasn't a Gambian, imagine in 2009. And then so they said that he committed fraud, that he obtained the Gambian passport, illegally, that he wasn't a Gambian. So Uncle Pap was appearing before two courts at the same time. I could remember there was a particular day when he appeared at the Carnegie Magistrates Court, and at the same time in the afternoon he traveled. He had to rush to Banjul to appear before another court there. These two cases were happening simultaneously.
At the end of the day, he was acquitted.
Yes.
So then Yaya Damfa?
Yes, and
2007?
Yeah. And so Yaya Damfa actually was on an assignment with some Amnesty officials. Yaya Damfa used to work for Forea newspaper. He was the one who reported that he had seen Chief Mane at Fatoro police station. So he was arrested and detained.
That brings us to the end of the list of those arrested and detained. We went through 90 incidents, but involving about 140 individuals. Now to wrap it up, let's talk about the exiles before we talk about the repressive laws. Were you able to compile a list of the journalists who had to go on exile?
We definitely have to update it because the one we have is not an updated one. But then we do know that the Doha Center for Media Freedoms did conduct a study in 2010 on the situation, on the plight of Gambian journalists in exile. And some of the people that worked on that study were Amijuf Cole, who is now at the CRC, in Datafice CRC, also worked on that. And Uncle Demba Jao also worked on that report. And they discovered that at least 20% of practicing Gambian journalists were living in exile at the time. 20%.
That's 1/5. That's a significant percentage but could you commit to provide a list to the commission?
Yes.
And maybe the findings of that study that was carried out, such that the commission would have good information as to the plight of these exilees and who they are.
I certainly will provide the list.
Thank you. And then to wrap it up, let's talk about the laws that affected journalists and what's the situation as it stands. But before the situation as it stands, let's have a quick look at what the situation was, some of the problems that the journalists had to face, and the repressive laws that were used to muscle journalists or the practice of journalism. I recall that in the early part of your testimony, you talk about a colonial ordinance that was used to prevent the registration of Gambia Press Union. And later they had the Telegraph Act, was it? Which was also used to prosecute journalists. In fact, Mr. Babukar Gay was charged under the Telegraph Act, something like that. So you talked about problems in the Criminal Code, the Newspaper Registration Act, and the Information and Communication Act. So tell us a bit about these laws and how they affect journalists.
Well, like I said yesterday, a number of these laws were inherited from the colonial government. And of course, they were here when Jawara was here. What we do know is that the Jawara government didn't do so much of amendment of these laws, but nonetheless, they applied them on certain people. And when Jammeh came, he did a lot of amendments on these laws. So one of the laws, of course, is the Newspaper Registration Act, which was first amended by a decree, that is Decree 70 and 71, because the fee for registration of newspapers at the time was $1,000. So when they came in 1994, then they passed decree number 70 and number 71. So this decree number 70 and 71 increased the bond from $1,000 to $50,000. And then eventually in 2004, then they also amended the criminal code, the Newspaper Registration Act again, and this time they increased the bond from $50,000 to $500,000. Of course, we do know that this is not in line with international standards or even Gambia's obligation under international law, because it kind of like it commodifies media. You have to be rich to be able to exercise your right to freedom of expression, which is a fundamental, human right. And the international law generally frowns upon any kind of registration system that will place unnecessary burden on citizens to be able to exercise their right to freedom of expression. So they increased the bond in that manner. But during that particular amendment was also when they inserted a provision in the criminal code. This provision is on false publication and broadcasting, because the criminal code had what was called false news, but probably they were not satisfied with the scope of that, and then they inserted another provision to say false publication and broadcasting. And it was also during this period that they increased the fine or the penalty in general. I think, if I remember quite well, the penalty was about 1,000 or 600. I don't remember quite well, but when they came in, then that was when they increased it to a minimum of $50,000, and then you could be fined up to $250,000. And in terms of the jail term, I think it was from 6 months to 2 years imprisonment. So they kind of like the penalties became more draconian, and the definitions became quite overbroad. So that's what they did with the Newspaper Registration and Broadcasting Act. And that's under the...
But even in terms of the provisions in the criminal code with regards to false publication, they also increased the punishment with regards to sedition.
Yes, they also increased the punishment with regards to sedition also. Also the punishment is the same as the false publication and broadcasting.
And from jail terms of 6 months or a fine of $500 to now a fine of $50,000 minimum and maximum of $250,000, and a jail term of a minimum of 1 year, of to both fine and imprisonment.
Very well.
So for a seditious offense or publication, one can go to jail at least, say, for at most 1 year imprisonment and a fine of $250,000.
Very well. Yeah. So the criminal code has sedition also, and it has a number of provisions that are not friendly to the exercise and enjoyment of freedom of expression in general.
Criminal defamation?
Criminal defamation is also there, and also the same penalty. It has also been increased during that amendment in 2004.
And how about the Information and Communication Act of 2019, amended in 2013?
Yes, so the Information and Communication Act was originally passed in 2009. What happened was that they thought that they needed some piece of legislation to guide policy around information and communication infrastructure and related issues. So in 2013, then the government amended the act and inserted this particular provision. That is to say that if you publish any information on the internet which is false, then you go to jail for either a term of 15 years or you pay a fine of 3 million, or at the discretion of the court, you can both be fined and jailed. So this is also I mean, it's the most obnoxious law we have with regards to media and freedom of expression rights, because it's also a strict liability offense. I mean, once it's false, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. I mean, you get the penalty.
And because this is publication on the internet, it affected not only those in Gambia, but also those who were not out in Gambia.
In fact, it was mainly targeted at those, because internet by 2013 became very influential in the political discourse. And a lot of information was being sent out from the Gambia to a lot of publications outside. And mainly, these were done by people who were working in the system and were sitting on some information that were of legitimate public interest. And of course, they will share them. And the regime didn't like that. So that was why they came with this particular provision.
But of course, that time there were a lot of online newspapers dealing with Gambia, but we are not actually based or hosted in Gambia.
In fact, all the online papers that were operating during Jammeh's time were not based in the Gambia. All of them were operating from outside. Online journalism was quite criminalized.
Freedom newspaper?
Freedom newspaper was one of them. Jollof newspaper was one of them. Echo, Gainako.
Gambia Echo.
Yeah, so you had a lot of them.
So this provision actually targeted mainly those newspaper, those online newspaper outfits, correct?
Well, yes, it targeted those papers, but it also targeted those that are on the ground sharing information with those people. And also, it targeted social media activism by not necessarily journalists, but you had a lot of young people that were coming up at the time, and they were populating Facebook and also some other social media platforms and sharing information there. So it was targeting also those people.
So it was quite stifling.
It was.
Thank you very much. That brings me to the end of my questioning. I now hand over to Mr. Chair for any further questions and a final statement to the Secretary General of the Gambia Press Union. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Council, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General Jammeh. Notwithstanding the massive intimidation, harassment that you endured during the 22 years, the resilience shown by the journalists was quite remarkable. Did you operate under some code of conduct in the GPU or some internal self-regulation?
Okay, so there is a code of conduct for media practitioners in the Gambia. Matter of fact, the last time we reviewed and revised that was in 2016, and then we made sure that this code is widely circulated and every journalist gets a copy so that it becomes either your Bible or your Quran, because you should principally be guided by this code of conduct. In terms of the enforcement of the code, we just recently set up a media council, which is a voluntary self-regulatory mechanism that will be there to monitor compliance or otherwise of the code and also professional standards. So right now the council is set up and all the structures are put in place. They are just trying to get an executive secretary who will be responsible for the day-to-day affairs of the council.
Thank you very much indeed. Commissioners, if you have any questions? Yeah. Bishop, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Saikou Jammeh, you gave quite an impressive record of what the GPU had managed to do during those years of difficulty in this country. As an organization, you did quite well by engaging the services of lawyers for journalists who could not obtain one, and also you managed to pay the fines of journalists who were not able to pay their fines. Now, could you kindly tell me, how did you manage, to, get all these funds?
Well, the GPU, as a trade union and professional body, is a membership-based organization. Until Jammeh left, I think our membership was just around 250, because you had a lot of people who wouldn't want to come and register. Nonetheless, we do not discriminate against anyone in our interventions, except that they can't vote and be voted for. But membership subscription alone cannot take the GPU anywhere. So that's why the GPU very much gets funding from a lot of our partners. These are embassies, these are media rights organizations that are concerned about the welfare of journalists in the country. And I must say also some Gambians who have some money, and they are very glad to share some for humanitarian purposes, and they wouldn't want to be named. We had instances of those.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go from right to left. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Jammeh. My first question is on access to information for journalists. What were the restrictions that were placed on journalists to access relevant information for their work?
I must say that the Gambia had never, ever enjoyed any, distinct recognition of access to information from a legal point of view, from the 1970 Constitution to the 1997 Constitution. But of course, the way Jammeh was operating made it even more difficult, because journalists were denied access to public officials, whether it is those that are holding public information, or even public offices, or even public documents. I mean, these were materials that journalists were actually denied access to. I can in fact say that throughout the time that Jammeh was there at the presidency, the only time that some journalists were allowed to even access State House and to report from there was when Fado Camara was appointed the Director of Press and Public Relations. And of course, he had to do a lot of convincing of the president for him to allow the private press to cover the State House. But even then, it was very limited as to where you can go, what you can ask, and what you cannot ask. So generally, Gambians, particularly journalists, don't have access to information. In fact, at some point, I don't even think Gambians believed in the ordinary decency of sitting and discussing with journalists, because relationship with members of the public was characterized by fear and paranoia. You find 1 or 2 or 3 people sitting down and discussing, and once you identify yourself as a journalist, or they know you to be a journalist, and all of them will start shifting and say, oh no, let's keep quiet, there's a journalist here, before we all get into trouble. So it was that difficult. I do know that now, of course, we have to commend the president, because President Barrow, when he came, has started changing that narrative. Jammeh used to say that journalists are bad people, we are enemies of the people, we are enemies of development. And now that narrative is changing. And journalists, for us to be the legitimate representative of the people, our relationship with them must be defined by truth and honesty and trust.
The second question is, from what you have said, with all these repressive media laws, it would be natural for people to be very careful about how they go about their journalistic work. What was the level of self-censorship, if it existed at all, within the community, within the journalism community, and how did that affect the work of journalists?
There was a high degree of censorship and self-censorship. Matter of fact, every journalist who was operating in the country at the time, you had to at some point switch on what we call your survival mode.
A question, and you can just include this in your closing remarks. I would like to have your views on reform of the media as an institution, and I'd be very grateful if you can focus on the welfare of journalists particularly. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. If you can come to that at the end of the remarks, that would be great. Commissioner Kinte, you have the floor.
Thank you, Saikou. You made perfect deliberations over the period, the 2 days. You have just mentioned that even the local community are critical about journalists. My suggestion is journalists, the GPU in particular, must go out to consolidate the gains they have got through this new regime in the new Gambia. That now there is, to a large point, freedom of expression, and you are gaining more trust and respect from the communities. Is it not possible that you institute some sort of a law or proposal that each paper has a column which will go out to regularly remind journalists of their roles and functions, which will also go out to enlighten the community about the importance of journalism, and so on. That's one point I have. The other is, since now that the CRC is on, what has GPU done to ensure that they have been given enough room, adequate, I will underline, adequate room for credible and competent performance?
I am not sure I fully understand the first question. If you could kindly...
Yeah, let me come back.
Yes.
We have agricultural column in many papers. There is a column on women and marriage or whatever, regular in some papers. Is it not possible that GPU, either by virtue of understanding with other with the media house, different media houses, that a column on journalism, it seems that there is need for people to increase awareness on the importance and the role of journalists, one. Also, it is going to help to regulate, because it will constantly remind journalists of their roles, the ethical need for their performance, and so on. I've not seen columns on journalism as such. That's what I'm suggesting. I said whether GPU has that in their plans to make sure there is broader awareness and trust and confidence on journalism.
Yes, so to that particular question, so the thing is, I think journalism is a craft, just like, in some ways it's a craft, just like carpentry and metalwork. And usually what we say of these people is that they oftentimes focus on, making good beds for other people and not for themselves. So journalists hardly look inward to but I agree, it's very important that we do a lot of programs around media literacy across the country, and we have rolled out some programs. We, even when Jammeh was here, we had a lot of sensitization programs with the security, and that changed a lot of things. We had a lot of sensitization with the civil society people, with government, and this coming Thursday, we are going to have a program with the Bar Association and the judiciary, so that we could improve the relationship between the legal fraternity and the media fraternity as well. In terms of the CRC, when they came, we also paid a courtesy visit to them, and then we submitted a position paper to the CRC. In fact, a 42-page position paper that we submitted to the CRC, proposing, some, broad and generous protection for not only freedom of expression, but for the journalism as a profession. Because when you look at the 1970 Constitution, it recognizes, press freedom as a fundamental human right. And in fact, it gives the media the role of holding the government accountable to the people and also to promote the objectives of the Constitution. So that is there. But what is so far unstated and untested is whether we, as a journalist, have a right to do the activities that we do without any interference by anyone. So these are some of the proposals that we gave to the CRC.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Jones. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Okay, Deputy Chair, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Saikou, for a very exhaustive testimony. I have got 3 short ones. One is in relation to Dr. Dudu Sani. You talked about his wife, but you did not talk about his children. Did he leave a family behind?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Actually, he has 5 children. All of them are there. Yeah.
We'll get back to that because it's
Yes.
critical for us to know
Thank you.
about these
Yeah,
issues.
thank you. I forgot to mention that. Yeah. Yeah.
Now the other one is in the area of women. In this long list, I only got 2 women's names. That's Sarata and Ramatulai. Were there any other women, or were these the only 2 women who were arrested and detained during this period?
That we have in our records so far. Yes.
Just to add on to that, we have Fatou Jaumane and Fatou Kamara added to the list.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for.
Thank you. And of course, Ndeitafa also having been harassed in exile. But
Sure.
Yeah. 5 women,
Yes,
so to
5.
speak.
Now, the last one is more technical. In addition to your reaching out or taking cases to the ECOWAS Community Court and to reaching out to the AU, did the GPU as a body reach out to other international human rights organizations, either in the way of lobbying or submitting reports or shadow reports, whatever it is? That is if you have those reports, it would be helpful to know.
Yes, in 2010 we made a submission to the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and in 2014 also we made a submission. And this year the Gambia is due for hearings at the UPR in October, and then we made a submission again. So this will be a 3rd time that we are making such submissions at the UPR, besides the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and also the ECOWAS Court of Justice. And even the Supreme Court of the Gambia, we did file some cases there.
Thank you very much.
That's good. Thank you very much. Any more questions on the left-hand side? No? Is it, thank you very much. Mr. Jammeh, if you have any closing remarks to make, please proceed.
Well, I think in my closing, I might want to come from an unlikely corner, that is particularly the issue of children. I mean, I have been following the Trrc through and through, and one of the things or testimonies that were coming out was about the fact that some of the people that were the leaders of these atrocities, of these very heinous crimes, had a very difficult childhood upbringing. And of course, for someone like me, that reminds me that as a society, what kind of environment have we created for our children to grow up, in a very comfortable manner. And for the Commission's work, I think it will be very important we explore that as well, so that we promote issues of social protection, particularly for children. Because when you look at what happened in the Gambia, in the case of Jammeh, you look at what happened elsewhere, from Congo to Libya, where you had the Gaddafis, you had the Mabutus, even as far as to Russia, I mean, where you had these talents, you know that these are all people who had a very difficult childhood upbringing. So if you don't take care of children at this point, at some point they come back to haunt society. I was recently doing some work with a colleague of mine, and one of the information that I needed was the number of orphans that we have in the country. And we know that this is a huge problem in the Gambia right now. But nationally, there is no statistics to show the number of orphans that we have in the country. And we know that for religious reasons, for social reasons, women are giving birth and then some of them are dumping their children. But who is accounting for these children? I think in a broader perspective, the Commission should particularly look into that. And then when coming back to the media, of course, what I would want us to look at is for everyone in the Gambia to not see an attack on journalists in isolation, because the journalists are not enemies of the people. The journalists are friends of the people. The people who are enemies of the people are those that seek to supplant our freedom with fear. There is no question about that. And when an attack is made on a journalist, know that this is an attack that is aimed at curtailing the rights and freedoms of every individual in society, because press freedom became the first casualty of the Jammeh regime, and we all know what that resulted into. I mean, we are talking about the human rights violations, we are talking about the looting of our money, we are talking about underdevelopment of the country. All this were there because the media has failed or was supposed to fail in its responsibility to hold the government to account. And that was because the media was gagged and the people were sitting comfortably looking at how journalists were being arrested, killed, and tortured. And I think every person in the Gambia should see that journalists are our representatives. I mean, for me, let me take an example of me. When I started this practice, I was always happy to go to bed hungry, knowing that perhaps I talked to a woman who was struggling to put food on the table for the kids, or maybe a woman whose house got burnt and got some money from elsewhere, even though I was going to bed hungry. Because that's the social contract we have with the people. So people should see us as legitimate representatives of theirs. And for the Commission, we believe in this process, and we submit ourselves entirely to this process, because so much had happened with very little answers, so many terrible things, with no justice at all. And all these years, we were looking for answers, we were looking for justice, we were looking for truth. We couldn't find it anywhere. So that's why we submit ourselves wholly to this Commission, in the hope that the Commission will get to the bottom of the truth of what happened in cases where crimes were committed against journalists. So that is essentially our submission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, everyone here.
Thank you very much indeed, especially those very wise words on how we raise our children in our society. What you have referred to as a universal phenomenon, the individuals that you recall indeed had difficult childhood or things that they had gone through. But thank you again very much for coming to testify before us. Sorry we kept you in that chair for a long time, and the things that you had to go through. Extraordinary memory you have about that. Thank you again so much for coming. We will, Council, we have witness ready for the afternoon.
Yes, after the lunch break.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much. So we will take a lunch break, 1 hour, come back at 2:30 sharp. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.